Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of 1968 toward the ancient, winding streets of Lviv. Close your eyes and imagine a city built of stone and memory, where the air is thick with the scent of roasted coffee and the damp, earthy perfume of the coming spring. The year is 1968. In the heart of western Ukraine, the Soviet night is deep and heavy, a velvet curtain drawn over the cobblestone alleys and the grand, Baroque facades that have stood for centuries. Here, the street lamps cast long, amber puddles of light onto the slick, uneven ground, and the silence is so profound that you can hear the distant, rhythmic hum of the city's electric heart. Lviv is often called the Little Paris of the East, a place where the Austro-Hungarian ghosts still linger in the ornate ironwork of the balconies and the crumbling stone of the statues. But beneath this old-world elegance, a new kind of darkness is beginning to stir. It is a darkness that does not belong to the past, but to a man named Vladimir Sulima. At 21 years old, he is a figure moving through the mist, a shadow among shadows, carrying with him a heavy, silent weight that the city does not yet recognize. The spring of 1968 arrived with a deceptive softness. The snow had melted away, leaving the soil in the city parks moist and dark, ready for the blooming of the chestnut trees. People walked with their coats unbuttoned, feeling the first gentle caress of the warmer air on their faces. It was a time of quiet routine. The Soviet citizens moved with a measured pace, their lives governed by the steady tick of the clock and the predictable flow of the working day. In the evenings, the trams would rattle and clank along the steel rails, their wheels sparking against the tracks, carrying tired souls back to their warm kitchens and the soft glow of their lamps. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, the atmosphere of Lviv would shift. The grand parks, like Stryiski or the quiet wooded areas near the local stadiums, would become cathedrals of shadows. The towering trees stood like sentinels, their branches interlocking overhead to filter the moonlight into jagged, silver shards. It was here, in these quiet, green lungs of the city, that the silence began to feel different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a sleeping town, but a watchful, bated breath, as if the very leaves were waiting for something to break the stillness. Let us follow the footsteps of a woman named Galina. It is an evening in late March, and she is walking home, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement with a steady, comforting rhythm. She carries with her the faint scent of the soap she used that morning and the lingering warmth of a day spent among friends. The air is cool, but not biting, and she pulls her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders, feeling the rough texture of the wool against her skin. She decides to take a shortcut through the park, a path she has walked many times before. The grass is still short and tender, swaying slightly in the breeze. To her left, the silhouette of the stadium rises up like a dormant beast, its concrete walls cold and gray in the moonlight. She hears the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth, a sound that would normally be ignored, but tonight it makes her heart flutter just a fraction faster. She tells herself it is nothing. She breathes in the scent of the wet pine needles and the distant smoke from a chimney. The world feels vast and empty, a wide expanse of silver and black where she is the only living thing moving. She does not see the figure standing perfectly still beneath the shadow of a wide oak tree. She does not see the way his eyes follow the movement of her coat, or the way his hand tightens around the cold, heavy iron of a hammer hidden in his pocket. The transition from peace to terror is often silent at first. There is a moment when the air seems to grow heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by a thick, suffocating weight. Vladimir Sulima moves with a predatory grace, his boots making no sound on the damp earth. He is a man of average height, unremarkable in every way except for his ears, which are large and slightly protruding, a detail that will one day be etched into the memory of a witness. But tonight there are no witnesses, only the trees and the cold, unfeeling stars. He steps out from the shadows, and for a heartbeat, Galena thinks he is merely another traveler, a fellow citizen heading home. She might have even prepared a polite nod or a small smile. But then, the rhythm of the night breaks. The hammer, a tool of construction turned into an instrument of destruction, swings through the air with a dull, whistling sound. The impact is sudden and final, shattering the fragile peace of the park. There is no scream, only the heavy thud of a body meeting the ground, and the sound of the wind sighing through the branches above. The blood pools slowly, dark as ink in the moonlight, soaking into the hungry soil of Elvive. Vladimir stands over her for a long time, his breathing shallow and rapid, his pulse thrumming in his throat. He feels a strange, cold power coursing through him, a feeling that he has finally made his mark on a world that tried to crush him since he was a child. As the hours of the early morning crawl toward dawn, the park remains a tomb. The dew begins to settle on the grass, forming tiny, glistening pearls on the hem of Galena's skirt. The first birds begin to stir, their chirping soft and tentative, unaware of the tragedy that lies beneath the canopy. It is a dog walker, an elderly man with a limping gait and a tattered gray coat, who first finds her. His hound, a creature of scent and instinct, pulls at the leash, its low whine cutting through the morning mist. The man follows, his breath hitching in his chest as he sees the shape on the ground. At first, he thinks someone has simply fallen asleep, perhaps a reveler who had too much to drink. But as he draws closer, the reality settles in with the weight of a mountain. He sees the stillness of her hand, the pale skin looking like marble against the dark earth. He sees the horrific damage, the way the silence of the night has been permanently etched into her form. He stumbles back, his heart hammering against his ribs, and the quiet of the Soviet night is finally, irrevocably broken by his cry for help. The news will spread slowly, whispered behind closed doors and over kitchen tables, as a city that prided itself on its culture and safety begins to realize that a monster is walking among them. This was only the beginning for Vladimir Sulima. The first whisper in the park had been spoken, and it would soon grow into a deafening roar of fear that would haunt Elvive for months to come. The morning light that once touched the park fades into a long, gray afternoon, and as the clock hands of 1968 creep forward, the industrial silhouette of Perm begins to change. The air here carries the heavy, metallic scent of the nearby railway, a scent that seems to thicken as the sun dips below the horizon. The sky turns the color of a bruised plum, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones and the concrete faces of the apartment blocks. This is the hour of the shift, where workers with tired eyes and heavy wool coats trudge toward the warmth of their kitchens, their boots clicking rhythmically against the damp pavement. But in the gaps between the streetlights, in those pockets of absolute black where the light fails to reach, something else is moving. It does not walk with the heavy stride of a laborer. It moves with a lightness that is unsettling, a quiet intention that suggests it has been waiting for the sun to die. The city feels smaller now, the distance between the safe, yellow glow of a window and the safety of a locked door suddenly feeling like a vast, treacherous expanse. Vladimir Sulima knows these shadows better than any map. He is a man of the periphery, born into a world of harsh discipline and religious fervor that left him hollowed out, filled only with a restless, dark energy. As he walks, the weight in his pocket is a comfort, a heavy, cold hammer, its wooden handle worn smooth by his grip. In the 1960s, the streets of the Soviet Union are meant to be safe, a place where the collective watches over the individual, but the reality of the twilight is different. He lingers near the locomotive stadium, where the air is stagnant and the grass is overgrown. He watches the silhouettes of women as they navigate the shortcut across the railway tracks, their figures silhouetted against the distant, flickering lights of the station. He listens to the crunch of gravel under their heels, a sound that, to him, is a countdown. He is not a ghost, though he moves like one. He is a predator who has learned that the architecture of the city is his greatest ally. The narrow alleyways and the blind corners of the stairwells are his hunting grounds, and he inhabits them with a terrifying patience. The dread in Perm does not arrive all at once. It seeps in like a rising tide. It begins with whispers over tea in small, cramped kitchens, talk of a man who appears and vanishes before the scream can even leave the throat. By the spring of 1968, the patterns are becoming harder to ignore. The attacks are brutal, sudden, and marked by a singular, violent signature. The heavy thud of the hammer against bone is a sound that haunts the nightmares of those who survive. Sulima does not speak. He does not need to. He is a force of nature that strikes when the light is at its most deceptive. Think of the texture of a Soviet evening, the smell of coal smoke, the taste of cold, damp air on the tongue, and the sound of a distant train whistle that only serves to emphasize the silence that follows. In this silence, the footsteps of the Twilight Stalker are the only thing that matters. He watches Galena as she nears the stadium, the lights of the city dimming behind her, the iron of the tracks cold and unforgiving beneath the soles of her shoes. The escalation is inevitable, a dark hunger that can no longer be satisfied by the mere thrill of the chase. There is a specific kind of fear that takes root when the monster has a face that looks like any other. Vladimir Sulima is 21 years old, a husband, a father, a man who goes to his job at the Polytechnic Institute and returns home as if the blood on his mind has no reflection in the mirror. He is unremarkable in a crowd, except for a single, jarring detail that some will later recall with a shiver. Witnesses, children playing their war games in the ruins of the evening, see him from the periphery of their vision. They notice his ears, large and bulging, catching the dim light as he leans into the darkness. It is a small, human detail that makes the horror feel all the more grounded. As the months of March, April, and May pass, the number of victims grows. 3 women do not return home, their lives extinguished in the cold, unblinking shadows of the Perm Railway. Others survive, but they carry the weight of that hammer in their minds forever. The city is now a labyrinth of locked windows and bolted doors, where even the sound of the wind rattling a loose shutter is enough to stop the heart. He moves through the night with a predatory grace, his senses heightened by the adrenaline of the hunt. Each attack is a lesson, a refining of his craft. He learns the rhythm of the city's heartbeat, when the police patrols are distant, when the residents are most distracted by their own exhaustion. He stands in the doorways of the gray, concrete blocks, his breath invisible in the chilling night air. He waits for the click of a latch, the soft glow of a hallway light that reveals a solitary figure. The transition from the stalker to the attacker is instantaneous. One moment, there is only the hum of the city. The next, there is the whistling of a hammer through the air. The violence is clinical, devoid of the passion that often marks such crimes, which makes it all the more terrifying. It is a calculation, a cold extraction of power in a world that feels increasingly powerless. The authorities are searching, but they are looking for a monster, not a man with a medical card and a family, not a man who walks the same streets they do during the light of day. As June arrives, the heat begins to settle over the city, but the coldness of the Twilight Stalker remains. The atmosphere is thick with a collective paranoia that transcends the boundaries of the neighborhood. People stop walking alone. The shortcuts through the park and the railway tracks are abandoned, left to the weeds and the ghosts of those who met him there. Sulima, however, is emboldened. His confidence is a poison, spreading through his veins and pushing him toward riskier, more brazen acts. He no longer waits for the absolute cover of night. He moves in the gray blur of the early morning, when the world is caught between sleep and waking. He watches a woman ascend a pedestrian crossing over the tracks, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He feels the hammer in his hand, a heavy, silent witness to the carnage he has already wrought. He follows her, his large ears twitching at the sound of her breath, his eyes fixed on the back of her neck. The net is beginning to tighten, though he does not yet feel the pull of the rope. The city is holding its breath, waiting for the one mistake that will bring the shadow into the light. The transition into June has brought a thick, stifling warmth to the city, but for the investigators in Perm, the memory of the winter thaw remains frozen in their minds. They look back to the early months of 1968, when the ground was a treacherous mosaic of gray slush and blackened ice. Near the heavy, rusted iron gates of the locomotive stadium, the air had been sharp with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the nearby railroad tracks. It was here that the first shadow fell, a darkness that did not dissipate when the sun finally broke through the clouds. The authorities, dressed in their heavy wool coats that smelled of stale tobacco and dampness, moved with a forced, rhythmic patience. They knew that in this era, there were no digital footprints to follow, no satellites to watch from above, and no rapid databases to consult. There was only the physical world, the stubborn reality of the earth, and the faint, vanishing impressions left behind in the melting crust of the late-season snow. They knelt in the mud, their fingers numbing as they traced the outlines of a boot print that was already losing its definition to the slow, steady drip of the afternoon sun. As the investigation deepened, the sheer scale of the challenge became apparent. The Soviet bureaucracy of 1968 was a mountain of paper, a labyrinth of typed documents and handwritten ledgers that stretched across thousands of miles. To find a single man in a city of hundreds of thousands required a level of manual labor that is difficult to fathom today. Detectives sat in cramped, dimly lit offices where the only sound was the scratching of fountain pens and the distant, muffled clatter of a typewriter in the hallway. They were forced to cross-reference every name, every residence permit, and every work history by hand, pulling dusty folders from floor-to-ceiling shelves. The scent of old parchment and wood polish filled the air, a dry, suffocating contrast to the humid June heat building outside. There was no DNA profiling to offer a shortcut, no thermal imaging to peer into the shadows of the industrial zones. Every lead was a thread that had to be untangled with raw intuition and the tireless pounding of boots on pavement. They moved through the neighborhoods, knocking on heavy wooden doors that groaned on their hinges, asking the same questions over and over until the words felt hollow in their mouths. A breakthrough finally emerged from the most unlikely of places, carried on the voices of children. In the periphery of a construction site where the mud was thick and the skeletal frames of new apartment blocks reached toward the gray sky, a group of boys had been playing a war game. They darted between the stacks of lumber and the piles of brick, their imaginations fueled by the stories of the Great Patriotic War. But their game had been interrupted by a sight that was all too real. In the fading twilight, they had seen a man moving with a strange, predatory grace. One boy, his eyes wide and his breath hitching in the cold air, noticed a detail that would become the cornerstone of the hunt. He described a man with features that seemed slightly askew, dominated by large, bulging ears that caught the dying light. It was a singular physical trait that gave the faceless monster a name and a shape. The investigators seized upon this detail, their pencils flying across sketch pads as they tried to capture the essence of the silhouette the boy had described. This was the primitive forensic art of the time, a composite of memory and fear, rendered in charcoal and lead. The search shifted to the industrial heart of the region, where the smog from the factories draped over the streets like a heavy, gray blanket. The investigators knew that the man they sought, now whispered about as the Hammer Maniac, was likely hiding in plain sight, perhaps working in one of the very institutes or factories they passed every day. They began a methodical sweep of the local clinics and hospitals, believing that his violent impulses might have left physical marks on him as well as his victims. The air in these medical facilities was heavy with the sharp, medicinal sting of antiseptic and the low, droning hum of outdated machinery. They spoke to nurses in starched white caps who kept meticulous, handwritten records of every patient who walked through their doors. It was a slow, grinding process, a war of attrition against a phantom. They looked for anyone with a history of erratic behavior, anyone who had disappeared for days at a time during the spring thaws, or anyone whose physical description matched the boy's haunting memory of those prominent ears. The tension in the investigative rooms was palpable, a quiet desperation that grew with every day the June sun rose higher in the sky. Fate finally intervened in a small, crowded clinic on the outskirts of the city. A woman who had narrowly survived a brutal encounter only days prior was waiting for a routine checkup. As she sat on a hard wooden bench, the sunlight filtering through the grime-streaked windows, she looked up and felt the world tilt on its axis. Standing just a few feet away, clutching a tattered medical card, was the man from her nightmares. The recognition was instantaneous, a jolt of pure ice through her veins. He saw her, too, and for a heartbeat, the silence in the clinic was deafening, broken only by the sound of a distant clock ticking toward the hour. He bolted, his heavy boots thumping against the linoleum floor as he vanished into the labyrinth of the building. But in his haste, he had made a critical, fatal error. He had left behind his medical card, a small piece of cardboard that contained his full name, Vladimir Sulima, and his home address. The paper was thin and slightly yellowed at the edges, but to the investigators who finally held it in their hands, it was the most valuable object in the world. The paper trail had finally ended, and the hunt was about to reach its inevitable, thundering conclusion as the summer shadows began to lengthen. To understand the man who would become known as the Hammer Maniac, we must travel back to a house governed by fear and the scent of cold tallow candles. Vladimir Sulima was born in 1946 into a family where the air was thick with the weight of religious sectarianism. His father was not a man of mercy, but of iron and brimstone, a fanatic who viewed the world through a lens of punishment. Imagine a young boy forced to kneel for hours on dry, jagged grains of buckwheat, the sharp edges digging into his skin until the pain became a dull, humming vibration. His father's voice would rise and fall in prayer, a rhythmic drone that offered no comfort, only the threat of more suffering. There were times when the boy was pushed into a wooden barrel and cast into the darkness of a ravine, tumbling into the silence and the cold until he lost consciousness. In those moments of sensory deprivation and terror, the child Vladimir did not find God. Instead, he found a profound, hollow emptiness. He learned that power was something one exerted over the weak, and that pain was the only language that truly resonated in the quiet corners of the soul. By the time he was a teenager, the boy who had been broken by fanaticism was beginning to seek ways to break the world around him, his internal compass spinning wildly in the dark. As Vladimir entered his adolescence, the shadows within him began to stretch and take shape. At the age of 14, in 1960, he committed his first act of extreme violence, an incident involving a firearm and an adult victim that signaled a dangerous escalation. By 1962, when he was only 16 years old, the authorities finally caught up with him. He had been stalking the dense, whispering trees of the Chernyshevsky forest, committing more than a dozen horrific acts against women who had thought they were safe in the dappled sunlight of the woods. He was sentenced to 8 years in a penal colony for minors, a place of gray concrete and the constant clanging of metal doors. Yet, even in the harsh environment of the prison, Vladimir was an anomaly. He possessed a strange, unsettling magnetism that left both the inmates and the educators confused. Rumors began to swirl about his physical presence, a disturbing fascination that earned him a bizarre degree of leniency. He was not a typical prisoner. He was observant, quiet, and deeply manipulative. He learned how to navigate the systems of power, playing the role of the reformed youth while keeping his true nature submerged beneath a calm, glassy surface. The prison officials, convinced that he had truly changed his ways, granted him parole in 1966. He had served less than half of his sentence, walking out of the iron gates and back into the world as a man who had learned exactly how to hide in plain sight. In the late 1960s, the city of Perm was a place of industry and routine, and Vladimir Sulima fit perfectly into its rhythm. He secured a job as a driver for the Polytechnic Institute, a position that allowed him to blend into the daily commute of thousands. To those around him, he was remarkably unremarkable. He was a man with a steady hand on the steering wheel, a man who arrived on time and kept his clothes neat. He married a woman who believed she had found a stable, hard-working partner, and soon the small cries of a newborn child filled their apartment. In the evenings, the air in their home might have smelled of boiling cabbage and fresh linens. Vladimir would sit in the soft glow of a desk lamp, perhaps holding his child or sharing a quiet meal with his wife. This was the mask of the ordinary man, the devoted father, the reliable employee, the polite neighbor. But beneath the veneer of domestic peace, the old hungers were beginning to stir. He was a creature of two worlds, walking through the sunshine of a respectable life while carefully maintaining the equipment of a predator. Tucked away in the cabin of his truck was a simple, heavy tool, a hammer. It was an object that belonged in a toolbox, something functional and mundane, yet in Vladimir's mind, it was becoming an extension of his own violent intent. He would drive through the streets of Perm, watching the crowds of women, his eyes lingering on the shadows of the alleyways, waiting for the moment when the mask could finally slip. The psychological profile of Vladimir Sulima is a study in the compartmentalization of evil. He did not appear to be a monster. He did not have the wild eyes or the frantic energy of the stereotypical madman. Instead, he was cold, methodical, and chillingly patient. He had learned in his childhood that the world was a place of arbitrary cruelty, and he had decided to become the one who dispensed it. When the spring of 1968 arrived, the thawing snow and the budding trees seemed to trigger something deep within him. He began to go hunting with the regularity of a man going to a second shift at a factory. He would leave the warmth of his family home, the scent of his child's hair still lingering on his clothes, and step into the damp, cool night of Perm. He favored the areas near the railroad tracks and the stadium, places where the city's lights began to flicker and fail. He would watch a lone woman walking home from a late shift, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, and he would follow. There was no grand plan, no complex motive other than a desperate, hollow need for control, a need to replicate the terror he had felt as a boy in a barrel. But this time, he was the one looking down into the dark. He moved with a terrifying silence, his breathing steady, the hammer heavy and cold in his grip. To the victims who survived, he was a ghost that struck from the periphery of their vision, a man with large, distinctive ears and a gaze that held no spark of humanity. He was the ordinary man you might pass on the stairs, the driver you might wave to in traffic, never knowing that behind that calm face lay a void that could never be filled. The winter of 1970 stretched across the city like a heavy, frost-bitten shroud, refusing to yield to the coming spring. In the narrow corridors of the local investigators' offices, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of radiator heat. Maps of the districts were pinned to the walls, their surfaces scarred by dozens of red ink circles that marked where the shadow had fallen. Each circle represented a moment of shattered peace, a life interrupted by the man the press had begun to whisper about in hushed, terrified tones. The detectives worked in a state of quiet desperation, their eyes bloodshot from nights spent poring over contradictory statements and blurry photographs. They knew he was moving among them, a ghost in a heavy wool coat, blending into the sea of workers who flooded the streets at dawn. The silence of the city felt different now. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a sleeping giant, but the breathless, jagged silence of a witness holding their breath in the dark. Breakthroughs in such cases rarely arrive with a fanfare of trumpets. Instead, they come in fragments, small and sharp as shards of broken glass. It began with the children. In the courtyard of a gray, concrete housing block, a group of young boys had been playing a spirited game of soldiers among the frozen snowbanks. As they darted behind the rusted frames of playground swings, their laughter died away when they noticed a man watching them from the periphery of the shadows. One boy, sharper than the rest, noted a singular physical trait that would later become a cornerstone of the manhunt. He described a face that was otherwise unremarkable, save for the ears, large, prominent, and slightly misshapen, catching the pale afternoon light in a way that seemed almost grotesque. This detail, shared in a trembling voice to a weary officer, gave the investigators their first real anchor. They began to look for a man who didn't just hide in the dark, but someone whose very anatomy betrayed him when the light hit him just right. The description was circulated. A whispered warning passed from precinct to precinct, as the net began to twitch with the weight of its potential catch. The most harrowing piece of the puzzle fell into place through the sheer, terrifying resilience of a survivor. Imagine a stairwell, the air smelling of damp concrete, and the faint, lingering aroma of cabbage soup from a nearby kitchen. A young woman was returning home, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing against the stone steps. She didn't hear him behind her until it was too late. The attack was swift, a brutal display of force involving a heavy, cold-headed hammer that he carried concealed in his coat. But she fought. In the frantic, oxygen-starved scramble for her life, she saw him. She felt the rough texture of his sleeve and smelled the sharp, chemical scent of industrial grease that clung to his skin. She survived the night, her spirit unyielding even as her body mended, and it was her memory, vivid and scorched by trauma, that would lead the police to the threshold of the suspect's world. She remembered the way he moved, a heavy, deliberate gait that suggested a man used to carrying weight, a man who moved with a terrifying, mechanical purpose. Fate finally intervened in the most mundane of settings, a local medical clinic. In the spring of 1971, the halls of the clinic were a symphony of low murmurs and the rhythmic squeak of nurses' shoes on polished linoleum. The survivor was there for a routine checkup, her eyes scanning the waiting room with the habitual caution of someone who had looked into the face of a monster. And then the world stopped. There, sitting among the elderly and the ill, was the man. He was waiting for his turn, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his large, distinctive ears visible under the harsh, fluorescent lights. The recognition was instantaneous, a jolt of pure adrenaline that turned the air in her lungs to ice. She managed to slip away to a telephone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the authorities. The tension in that waiting room became a living thing, thick and suffocating, as she waited for the law to arrive before he could vanish back into the gray urban sprawl. When the police arrived, the suspect realized the air had changed. He didn't wait to be questioned. In a sudden burst of movement, he bolted toward the exit, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. He escaped the immediate grasp of the officers, vanishing through a side door into the maze of the city. But in his haste, he left behind something far more valuable than a weapon. On the small wooden table where he had been sitting lay a medical card. It was a simple slip of paper, yellowed at the edges and smelling of old ink, but it contained a name that would soon be known to every household in the region. Vladimir Sulima. This bureaucratic artifact, a tiny piece of the very system he thought he could outsmart, became the ultimate betrayal. Investigators descended upon the records office, their flashlights cutting through the dust of the archives until they found his file. They found his address, his history, and the chilling realization that he had been hiding in plain sight, working a job that gave him the perfect cover to observe his victims without suspicion. The final hours of the hunt in April 1971 were conducted in total silence. The authorities didn't storm his door with sirens wailing. They waited. They watched the windows of his apartment as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the street. The air was still, the only sound the distant hum of a passing trolley car. When the moment came, it was clinical and quiet. Sulima was intercepted near his home, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking shut over his wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty street. He didn't struggle, he didn't scream. He simply looked at the men surrounding him with a blank, hollow expression, as if he were a machine that had finally run out of power. The net had closed. The monster who had haunted the dreams of the city for 3 long years was no longer a shadow or a ghost. He was just a man in a worn coat, standing in the fading light of a spring evening, finally stripped of his anonymity and his power to harm. The investigation was over, but the long, slow process of understanding the darkness he carried was only just beginning. The air inside the Minsk courthouse in the spring of 1972 was heavy with the scent of damp wool and floor wax. Outside, the city was waking up to a pale, drizzling morning, the kind where the mist clings to the branches of the birch trees like a tattered shroud. But inside those thick, stone walls, the world felt frozen. The courtroom was a cavern of polished mahogany and cold, white light that filtered through the high, arched windows. Every cough, every rustle of a legal brief, and every shifting footstep on the parquet floor seemed to carry the weight of the 3 years of terror that had preceded this moment. Vladimir Sulima sat in the prisoner's dock, a small wooden enclosure that seemed far too fragile to hold a man who had cast such a long and jagged shadow over the streets. He was quiet, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands resting motionless on his knees. To look at him, one might see only an ordinary man, perhaps a neighbor or a coworker, were it not for the distinct, heavy set of his features and the large, bulging ears that had become the primary focus of every witness's memory and every investigator's sketch. The prosecutor's voice was a steady, rhythmic drone, recounting the details we have walked through together. He spoke of the spring of 1968, when the peace of the city was first shattered near the Locomotive Stadium. He described the cold, metallic weight of the hammer, a tool meant for construction and creation, which Sulima had turned into an instrument of absolute finality. The room grew colder as the name of Galina Belanajko was read aloud, the first life extinguished in a cycle of violence that had seemed, for a long time, to have no end. The evidence was laid out on a long table draped in green cloth, a collection of items that looked tragically mundane. There were the heavy boots that had left their deep impressions in the mud near the railroad tracks, and the dark jacket that had blended so easily into the evening shadows. But the most haunting piece of evidence was the silence that followed the testimony of the survivors. One woman, who had seen him in the sterile white light of a clinic just days before his capture, spoke in a whisper that forced the entire room to lean forward, held captive by the memory of her fear. As the trial progressed through the final months of 1971 and into the early weeks of the new year, the public's obsession with the case began to shift from terror to a solemn, collective need for closure. People stood in long, silent lines outside the courthouse, their breaths blooming in the cold air as they waited for news. They wanted to know that the monster from the Locomotive Stadium was truly gone. In the evenings, families in Minsk would sit around their radios, the low hum of the tubes warming their living rooms, as they listened to the brief, controlled reports allowed by the state. The narrative was one of triumph for the authorities, but for the citizens, it was something more personal. It was the ability to walk past the stadium again without looking over their shoulder. It was the freedom to hear a footstep on the stairs and not feel their heart seize in their chest. The resolution was not just a legal verdict. It was a slow, painful reclaiming of the city's soul, brick by brick, street by street. When the judge finally stood to deliver the sentence, A silence fell over the room so profound that it felt as though the very walls were holding their breath. The words were chosen with a sharp, surgical precision. Under the laws of the Soviet Union, for the lives taken and the many more shattered, Vladimir Sulima was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. There was no outcry, no burst of emotion from the gallery. There was only a collective, heavy exhale, a sound like the wind dying down after a long and violent storm. Sulima himself did not flinch. He remained as he had been throughout the proceedings, a man who seemed already to have moved beyond the reach of the living. He was led away through the back corridors of the courthouse, the rhythmic metallic clink of his shackles echoing against the stone floors until the sound faded into the distance. In the months that followed, the sentence was carried out by firing squad in the early hours of a cold November morning. In that quiet, hidden moment, the chapter of the bloody Casanova was officially closed, leaving behind only the echoes of justice and the long process of forgetting. Minsk is a city of memory now. If you were to walk near the old stadium today, you would see only the normal rhythms of life. Athletes training in the sun, children playing on the grass, and the steady pulse of the railway nearby. The shadows that once held a predator have been lengthened by time and softened by the return of peace. The name of Vladimir Sulima has faded from the headlines, relegated to the dusty archives of criminal history, a ghost of 1968 that no longer has the power to haunt the living. We remember the victims not by the way they left this world, but by the light they carried within it. We honor the silence that has returned to the city, a silence that is no longer filled with dread, but with the quiet comfort of safety. The story of the hunt, the capture in the cold April of 1971, and the finality of the courtroom has reached its end. We can let the tension go now. We can let the images of the hammer and the shadows dissolve into the mist. The city is quiet, the streets are safe, the case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.